They thought they could build a hotel on his land without permission, until they realized he had one trick left to play. It was a warm day in early spring when Greg Anderson received the call. He had been away from his farm in rural Georgia for a few weeks, tending to family matters out of state. The smell of freshly cut grass and the wide expanse of his property seemed miles away. But in that moment, a familiar voice on the phone brought him back to reality. "Greg, you might want to take a look at this," his neighbor Jimmy said urgently. "There's some kind of construction happening on your land." Greg's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't authorized any construction. The farm had been his sanctuary, passed down through generations, a legacy of sweat and hard work. It wasn't just land, it was his history. He had dreamed of one day expanding it, building something meaningful. But no, this wasn't the dream he had in mind. Something wasn't right. After quickly hanging up, Greg found himself pacing in his small rented apartment, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. Who would be building anything on his land? He was out of state, far from home. Was this some kind of mistake? Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew better. The phone call had been unsettling, but Greg had always been a methodical man. A veteran of battles fought in the courtroom, he knew that what seemed like a small mistake could quickly spiral out of control if not addressed. He decided to act fast. Pulling out his phone, he scanned through his messages and found the local news app. And there it was, a headline that made his blood run cold. Local Homeowners Association, HOA, breaks ground for new hotel project. What? Right on former farmland. The picture attached to the article was enough to confirm Jimmy's words. Greg's land, his farm, had been marked with a huge banner and heavy machinery lined up in front of a construction site. It wasn't a mistake. He stared at the screen, the reality of it all sinking in. The HOA, an organization that had been eager to expand their influence in development projects, had decided to build a hotel right on his land, without his knowledge, without his permission. They had taken it upon themselves to seize what they thought was an empty piece of property. Greg wasn't there to defend it, and that made it easy for them to bulldoze ahead. But there was something the HOA didn't know. Greg had always been meticulous when it came to the land he had inherited. Over the years, he had quietly added a series of legal protections. He wasn't naive. He knew how ambitious developers could be. While others around him had been content to let things slide, Greg had been preparing for the possibility that someone might try to take advantage of his absence. He had set a trap, a legal one, that would keep his land safe. The HOA may have thought they were clever, but they didn't realize just how well Greg understood the system. They were about to learn a very hard lesson in property law, and Greg was ready to make sure they wouldn't walk away so easily. Greg's mind raced as he processed the situation. This wasn't just a fight over land. It was a fight over respect, over fairness, over the kind of life he had worked so hard to build. This wasn't the first time he had seen people take advantage of those they thought were vulnerable. But it would be the last. The hotel project was the catalyst, but it was the legal challenge he had been quietly preparing for that would become the true battleground. But while the HOA thought they had outwitted Greg, they were stepping right into a legal trap he had carefully laid. Greg wasted no time in gathering his thoughts. The news about the construction site hit him hard, but years of working in property law had prepared him for moments like this. While others may have panicked or felt helpless, Greg's mind was already turning, analyzing the situation. He knew this wasn't just a fight for land. It was a fight for something much bigger: his rights, his family's legacy, and his peace of mind. The first thing he did was contact his lawyer, Kelly Martinez. She had been with him through many legal battles before, guiding him through the complexities of zoning laws and property disputes. She was someone he trusted, and he needed her now more than ever. Kelly answered the phone on the second ring, and Greg wasted no time laying out the situation. "Kelly, I need you to check something for me. It looks like the HOA's gone ahead and started construction on my property without permission. I wasn't even consulted. It's a hotel project, and they're already on site." There was a brief pause before Kelly responded, her voice calm but concerned. "Greg, this sounds like a mess. We need to get a clearer picture of what's going on. I'll make some calls and check the property records. I'll also check with the county's building department. In the meantime, do you have anything in writing? A contract? Anything that might give us leverage?" Greg thought for a moment, his mind still reeling. Then it clicked. Years ago, when he first inherited the farm from his late father, he had taken steps to protect it. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to safeguard it so carefully, but it was something his father had always stressed. "Know your rights, son. People will try to take what's yours if you let them." Greg had taken that advice to heart, meticulously keeping records of everything. He had filed for easement rights, set up various deed restrictions, and ensured that any development on the land would require his explicit approval. It was these precautions that he now knew would save him. "I've got everything," Greg told Kelly, his voice steady now. "I kept the records, easement rights, deed restrictions, you name it. I didn't think I'd ever need them, but I've got what we need to fight back." Kelly didn't hesitate. "All right, I'll pull those documents, but we need to act quickly. The HOA may not know they've overstepped, but once they do, they'll fight hard to cover their tracks. We have to make sure they can't use any loopholes." Greg knew Kelly was right. As they hung up, he began gathering all the paperwork, scanning through decades-old records that he had kept neatly stored away. The more he read, the more he realized just how solid his legal foundation was. The deed restrictions were clear. No commercial development could take place on the land without his explicit consent. The easement rights, which he had set up years ago, ensured that no one could encroach on his land without facing severe legal consequences. But it wasn't just the legal documents that gave Greg confidence. Over the years, he had quietly made sure to keep tabs on the local property laws and any proposed changes in zoning regulations. He knew exactly where loopholes existed and how to exploit them. And now that knowledge was going to work in his favor. Greg knew this would not be a quick resolution. The HOA, like many others in the area, had deep pockets and political connections. But Greg had patience, and he knew the system. He wasn't going to let them bulldoze his family's legacy without a fight. He would use every legal avenue at his disposal to ensure that the hotel never saw the light of day. But as Greg prepared his legal battle, he had no idea that the HOA would not back down so easily. Their resolve was just as strong, and now the real fight was about to begin. By the time Greg had gathered all the paperwork and met with Kelly in person, the wheels were already in motion. He knew it was just a matter of time before the HOA caught wind of the legal trap he'd set for them. They had underestimated him, thinking that without his presence they could simply bulldoze their way through. But Greg wasn't the kind of man to let that happen, not without a fight. The first step was to send a cease and desist letter to the HOA. Kelly worked tirelessly to draft a document that would leave no room for ambiguity. It outlined every legal detail, his easement rights, the deed restrictions, and the zoning laws they had violated by attempting to build without his consent. The letter was blunt, clear, and most importantly, it was backed by solid evidence. Greg wasn't going to play nice. If the HOA wanted a legal fight, they would get one. Greg didn't have to wait long for the response. Less than a week after the letter was sent, he received a call from Kelly. "They're not taking this lying down, Greg," Kelly said, her voice tight with frustration. "I spoke to their attorney. He claims the property isn't subject to the restrictions you've mentioned. They think they can argue that your easement rights are outdated and no longer enforceable." Greg's eyes narrowed. He had known this would be the response. The HOA would try every tactic to skirt around the legal protections he'd set up over the years. They would twist the rules, drag things out, and rely on their deep pockets to wear him down. But Greg wasn't a man who would be intimidated, not by people who thought they could buy their way out of anything. "They can try," Greg muttered under his breath, feeling the adrenaline surge through his veins. But they won't get away with it. Kelly continued. They've already started talking about seeking a court order to continue the construction. It's going to be a race to see who can get their case heard first. Greg's thoughts raced. The HOA was planning to push forward, to take the matter to court, and use every bit of their influence to win. But he wasn't about to let that happen. The idea of a courtroom battle didn't intimidate him. It excited him. He had spent years learning the ins and outs of property law, and now that knowledge was going to be his weapon. That night, Greg stayed up late, reviewing case law and preparing for what he knew would be a long and exhausting fight. He wasn't just fighting for his land. He was fighting for fairness. The idea of an organization like the HOA thinking they could simply take whatever they wanted made his blood boil. He had to stop them, no matter the cost. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, research, and meetings. Greg and Kelly met with local officials to confirm the details of the land's zoning laws. They worked tirelessly to ensure that every document, every record, was in perfect order. Greg knew that in these types of battles, the smallest oversight could be the difference between winning and losing. He was determined not to let that happen. Meanwhile, the HOA pushed ahead with their plans. The construction site grew larger every day, and heavy machinery rumbled across the land. Greg could hear the noise from his farmhouse, even though he was miles away, but it only fueled his determination. He was ready for whatever came next. But as Greg prepared for the inevitable court battle, he couldn't shake the feeling that this fight was bigger than just a property dispute. It was a fight for respect, for the idea that no one could just walk over him or his family's history. And in that moment, he realized something that struck him deep. He wasn't just defending his land. He was standing up for every person who had ever been pushed aside, taken for granted, or ignored. As the construction continued, it became clear that the HOA wasn't going to back down without a fight. But Greg's resolve was only growing stronger. The moment Greg walked into the courthouse, he could feel the weight of the battle that lay ahead. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the entire building itself understood the stakes. This wasn't just about land or a hotel. This was a test of his strength and resolve, a fight for what he knew was right. Greg and Kelly had been working tirelessly for weeks, poring over every detail of the case, preparing for the legal showdown that was about to unfold. The HOA had hired an expensive attorney, someone with a reputation for getting things done, but Greg wasn't intimidated by money or power. He had fought tougher battles in the past, and he wasn't going to let anyone walk over him now. The courtroom was filled with people, mostly representatives from the HOA, some of whom Greg recognized from the local development meetings. They were all sitting at the defendant's table, their expressions a mix of annoyance and irritation. It was clear they didn't expect Greg to pose much of a challenge. After all, who would have expected a simple farmer to take on a powerful organization like the HOA? But Greg wasn't just any farmer. He was a man who knew the law better than most lawyers. He had spent years studying property rights, zoning laws, and legal precedents. He knew how to fight in court, and he was ready to use every ounce of that knowledge to take down the HOA. The judge, a middle-aged man with a stern demeanor, called the court to order. He glanced down at the papers in front of him, then looked up at both parties. "We're here today to settle a dispute over land use and property rights," the judge said, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "The defendant claims they have the right to develop the land, while the plaintiff is asserting that the land is subject to deed restrictions and easement rights. We'll hear opening statements from both sides." Greg's heart beat a little faster as the HOA's attorney stood up. The man, dressed in an expensive suit, cleared his throat and smiled as he approached the judge. "Your Honor, the property in question is ripe for development," he began, his tone smooth and confident. "The HOA has long planned for this hotel project, which will bring valuable economic growth to the area. The plaintiff's claims about deed restrictions are outdated and have no bearing on the current situation. We've followed all the necessary legal steps to secure permits and begin construction." The plaintiff is simply trying to obstruct progress. Greg's blood boiled as the attorney spoke. The man was lying, twisting the facts to suit his agenda, but Greg didn't let it rattle him. He had heard this kind of rhetoric before. It was the same excuse they always used: development for the greater good. The problem was, it wasn't for the greater good. It was about money. And Greg wasn't about to let them get away with it. When it was his turn to speak, Greg stood up slowly, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He looked at the judge, then at the faces of the HOA representatives. The courtroom fell silent. "Your Honor, I stand before you today not as a businessman, not as a developer, but as a man who has worked this land his whole life," Greg began, his voice steady but strong. "This land has been in my family for generations. It's not just property to me. It's my heritage. And I've taken every legal step to protect it. The HOA has violated my rights by proceeding with this project without my consent, and now they want to undermine the protections that are in place. I'm not here to stop progress. I'm here to stop an injustice." Greg could see the subtle shift in the room as he spoke. The judge's brow furrowed, and the HOA's attorney seemed less confident, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Greg wasn't just defending his land. He was challenging everything they stood for. The rest of the day was a blur of arguments and counter-arguments, legal jargon and documentation. Greg's side presented the easement rights, the deed restrictions, and the zoning laws that the HOA had clearly overlooked. Kelly argued with precision, pointing out how the HOA's permits were issued without proper review of the property's historical status. The evidence was overwhelming, and with each passing hour, Greg could feel the tide turning in his favor. But then, just as the proceedings seemed to be going in his direction, the HOA's attorney dropped a bombshell. He introduced a new piece of evidence, a letter from a local zoning commission that appeared to grant the HOA special permission to bypass certain restrictions for development. For a moment, Greg's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen this letter before, and it threw everything into question. Kelly quickly stood up, objecting. The letter had never been presented to them before, and it was clearly a last-minute attempt to sway the judge. The judge hesitated, clearly caught off guard. The courtroom was a battleground of words, where every piece of evidence and every argument had the potential to tip the scales. Greg could feel the tension in the air as the judge deliberated. The letter from the zoning commission that the HOA had presented had thrown a wrench into the works, but Greg wasn't ready to back down. Not now, not when everything he had worked for was on the line. Kelly leaned in, whispering just loud enough for Greg to hear. "We need to act fast. I'm filing a motion to dismiss that letter as invalid. It was never properly disclosed, and the timing is suspicious. We've got this, Greg. Just hang in there." Greg nodded, though a sense of doubt lingered in the pit of his stomach. The judge had given the zoning commission letter serious consideration, and in that moment it felt like everything he had done, everything he had prepared for, might crumble in front of him. But then the judge stood, breaking the silence with a heavy sigh. His eyes met those of both Greg and the HOA's attorney. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented, including this new document submitted by the defendant," the judge said, his voice firm. "However, I've also considered the history of this property and the nature of the easement rights in place. It's clear that the plaintiff, Mr. Anderson, took every legal step to protect his land. The letter from the zoning commission, while it may have been issued, does not appear to meet the full legal standards required for this type of exemption." Greg felt a wave of relief wash over him. The judge's words were like a lifeline thrown in the middle of a storm. The zoning letter had been dismissed, but there was still one more crucial decision to be made. "I am ruling in favor of Mr. Anderson," the judge continued. "The HOA is ordered to halt construction immediately and cease all further actions on this property. The project is in direct violation of the deed restrictions and easement rights established by Mr. Anderson." The room fell into stunned silence as the judge's gavel came down with a resounding thud. Greg could hardly believe it. He had won. The construction would stop. The land was his. But the victory didn't bring the immediate elation Greg had imagined. Instead, he felt a quiet sense of vindication, a relief that justice had been served, but also a realization that this battle had come at a price. The fight had been long, exhausting, and at times deeply isolating. It had pushed him to his limits and tested his resolve in ways he never anticipated. After the hearing, Greg stood up, his legs slightly trembling from the weight of the experience. Kelly smiled at him, offering a firm handshake. "You did it, Greg. The land is yours. The HOA is going to have to pay for what they've done, and you can finally put this behind you." Greg couldn't help but smile back, though his mind was still spinning. He looked out at the people who had been involved in the fight, the lawyer who had stood by him, the neighbor who had tipped him off, the judge who had made a fair decision. This wasn't just his victory. It was a victory for anyone who had ever felt powerless against an unjust system. As Greg left the courthouse, the weight of the years of legal preparation, the nights of uncertainty, and the doubts that had clouded his thoughts all seemed to melt away. For the first time in weeks, he felt the kind of relief that only comes when you know you've done everything right. Back home, as the sun set behind the fields of his farm, Greg stood on the porch watching the light dance across the land. The battle had been tough, but it had reminded him of something important. Sometimes the most important fights are the ones you don't see coming. And when you stand your ground, when you know your rights, and when you believe in something greater than yourself, victory can be yours. Greg's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Jimmy. "Glad to see you won, Greg. You showed them what it means to stand up for what's yours. Proud of you, man." Greg smiled and typed a quick response. "Thanks, Jimmy. We all did." In the end, it wasn't just about stopping the construction of a hotel. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against you. And Greg had proven that justice, no matter how long it takes, can prevail.
As Greg sat down in the quiet of his farmhouse that evening, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him. The months of anxiety, the court hearings, the sleepless nights spent poring over legal documents. It all seemed like a distant memory, but it wasn't just about the victory itself. It was about what the fight had taught him. He had faced adversity, fought for what was right, and had come out on. The morning after the ruling, Greg received a call from his lawyer, Kelly. "I spoke with the HOA's attorney," a note of satisfaction. "They're backing down. They're going to have to pay for the damages and the legal fees. It's a big win, Greg." Greg leaned back in his chair, the weight of the moment settling. "I didn't just win a case, Kelly. I won my land back. I protected my family's history. It's bigger than the money or the hotel." Kelly agreed. "Absolutely. This was about something more than just property. This was about standing up for, and you did that, something a lot of people wouldn't have." As the conversation ended, Greg couldn't help but feel a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. The pressure of the legal battle had taken its toll. But now he could. The hotel project was over, and the HOA had learned a hard lesson about the consequences of oversight. He spent the rest of the afternoon walking, inspecting the fields that had been in his. He marveled at how resilient, how despite every obstacle, every challenge, it continued to stand firm. It reminded him of his own journey. Like the land, he had weathered the storm and come out stronger. Later that day, Greg stood in front of his farmhouse, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was still, and everything felt like it was in its right place. He could feel the heartbeat of the farm beneath, the legacy of his father and his grandfather echoing through every. The fight had been fierce, but in the end, it had reaffirmed the value of what you protect is only as strong as your will. In a world where greed often prevails, and people are quick to take what doesn't belong to them, Greg had stood his ground and proven that there was still honor in holding on to what was rightfully. And though the fight had been long, it had also brought a reminder that justice, no matter how long it takes, is always worth the battle. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Greg sent one last message to Jim. "Thanks again for having my back through all this. It's over, but I'll never forget what we fought for." Greg placed the phone down, gazing out at the vast fields one last time before heading. He was ready to move forward, knowing that the land he had fought for was his, and no one could take it away. Sometimes the battles we face in life are more than just about winning. They're about protecting what matters most and standing firm in the face of adversity. Greg Anderson's fight wasn't just for land. It was a fight for honor,